Hello everybody, good morning. We're continuing here today with the situation of the Counter-Reformation and actually the impact that the Council of Trent had on the overall Reformation movement. And over the last couple of weeks we actually dealt with a few ideas like the doctrines that Trent dealt with in relation to the difference between the Catholic Church and the actual Reformers, in regard to things like the Mass, faith alone, Scripture alone, and that sort of thing. Scripture alone was already beginning to be shown to be the cause of some division among the Reformers, because there's two or three different strands of Christianity developing at this stage. You had Lutheranism, this is after about 30 years. You had Lutheranism on the one hand, and then of course in Switzerland you had what started out as Zwingliism then became the doctrines of John Calvin. And of course there was the Anabaptists as well in the 1520s. But then the faith alone doctrine that Lutheran developed in the 20s as well, that was actually sort of rejected by the church on the basis that it doesn't it's not actually basically in line with the Bible, especially the letter of James, where it says the opposite to actually the doctrine of faith alone. So in relation to the sacraments then, Luther wanted to reduce the sacraments down to 3, and some more radical reformers wanted to reduce it down to 2. But the church re-established the idea that the 7 sacraments go right back to the apostolic age, and therefore there's a dividing line there as well in relation to the Catholic, because a lot of people thought the Catholic Church might actually compromise in some of its doctrines and sort of try and meet the Reformers sort of halfway in regard to this. There was a lot of talk about that type of thing in the years leading up to the Council of Trent. But actually the Church didn't really compromise in relation to any of the doctrines actually. And then in regard to Scripture, there's basically a situation where there was at all times, going right back to the 4th century, going right back to the time that the Bible was first established, discerned by the church. There were 73 books of Scripture in the Bible. And of course, as I said in the last day, Luther discovered as he was translating the Bible in the 1520s, some of the books didn't agree with his rigid doctrine of faith alone. So he didn't remove those books, but he actually downgraded them, put them into a separate section. The church had to look at that too. Could they agree with him in relation to some of these things? But actually, the church actually stated quite clearly that the 73 books of the Bible that had always been used by the church, by all the great theologians like Augustine, Aquinas and all these people. So actually, in regard to doctrine, in regard to the sacraments, the true Bible, the actual faith alone and Scripture alone had already been fallen apart, because there was 3 major strands at this stage by the mid-40s in relation to the Christianity outside the church. Of course, it went into multiple denominations in subsequent centuries. But even then, Scripture alone was proven to be a doctrine that was actually falling apart and causing a lot of division within Christianity generally. That's actually in regard to doctrine. There's very little compromise, very little room for compromise in regard to doctrine. The church simply stood by the actual faith that had been there right going back to the apostolic age. In regard to reform, there was a lot more sort of room for manoeuvre there. There was a lot more recognition that Martin Luther and other reformers indeed as well actually had very good points in relation to certain levels of kind of institutional corruption that had crept into the church over the centuries. The church was an extremely powerful, extremely wealthy organisation by the year 1500. It owned about 20% of the land of Europe, which is hundreds of billions of pounds worth of land. It controlled a whole range of different areas of life, and it had tremendous power. It had far more property than it was able to actually defend, and that was part of the problem. Because when Luther invited in the nobles in Germany, that set a precedent all over Europe, where by nobles actually came in to reform the church, but actually basically took over the land, and that was a lot of the incentive in many cases. But in regard to the church did have major weaknesses in regard to, say, bishops, for instance. A lot of bishops were so wealthy. There's a theory at the time was known as pluralism, and what it meant was that one bishop from a very wealthy family generally would control and own maybe 3 or 4 different dioceses. And of course, he couldn't be present in them all, and very often wasn't much of a bishop in any of them. So these people were basically more like the nobility than they were like basically like bishops. So that needed to be reformed. The church recognised that some of these people were basically total wasters as bishops. They actually were very wealthy people. They had horse-drawn carriages, they had huge houses, palaces actually in many cases, and they were no addition to the church because they were given a very bad example of displays of wealth, and at the same time not doing their job. They weren't in their diocese to actually make sure that priests were doing their job. And there was a lot of nepotism and various different things, like people that were related to them or being made priests that weren't necessarily qualified or particularly well educated. And of course the Mass was in Latin, and therefore there was a very poor communication system between the church and the laity. As a result of that, Trent did bring about significant reforms in regard to bishops. It said that a bishop could only actually be a bishop in one diocese, and that he'd have to be in the diocese at all times. This was a massive change from what had existed prior to Trent. It was a really big change because it meant that actually the bishops had to supervise the lower clergy, and as a result keep an eye on things basically, and make sure that actually that both themselves and the clergy below them, priests and deacons, that were actually doing their job. So that was a big change. The second thing was that a lot of priests were actually poorly enough educated. Some of them, they were all literate by and large, but they weren't well educated. They didn't really know in depth the actual gospel. They weren't able to defend why certain beliefs were as they were. They wouldn't have been able to quote from the gospel if they were questioned on things, and therefore there was a recognition at Trent that there needed to be a far better education system brought about in order to train priests properly. One of the rules of Trent was that there would be a seminary in every diocese, and that didn't actually happen quickly, because there was war, there was instability all over Europe, and there was some territories that were controlled by perhaps a Catholic ruler, and there was a lot of reformers that wanted to actually express themselves. So there was some territories controlled by a Catholic ruler, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction in terms of people that wanted to follow the reform movement. And the opposite, of course, happened in other countries and other territories, like where you had reform rulers who were actually, and there was Catholic minority. So in situations like that, it took decades, in some cases it took centuries to actually establish the principles that were set down at Trent, which is that there should be a proper training of priests. So that was the whole reform in relation to both bishops and priests was something that the bishops at Trent very much took on board in relation to Luther's criticism, and indeed other reformers, both inside the church and outside the church. By the 1540s, there was a lot of different critics of the church. And the Council of Trent took all this on board and actually did attempt to implement various reforms, and to that extent they did listen to Luther. They did attempt to actually change the church, and in fact they brought about very significant change in regard to the way the priesthood and the bishops were actually going to run the church from that time forward. So Trent also set in place the whole idea of spiritual renewal, in terms of there was a sense of confidence that existed in the aftermath of the Council of Trent, whereby various different people, like I suppose one of the most famous would be Ignatius of Loyola, who actually formed the Jesuits, and that became very powerful movement over the next decades, actually right through for centuries. It still exists to this day. The actual Jesuits, in actual fact, the recent Pope Francis came from the Jesuit order. So that was actually a movement that started around the time of Trent, and also there's some great saints like Teresa of Avila and various different other great spiritual writers and bishops. So there's great spiritual renewal in the aftermath of Trent. So therefore Trent is regarded actually for a whole range of reasons. It brought about reforms. This is what's known as the Catholic Reformation, or the Counter-Reformation it's sometimes called. And then, of course, it clearly set down doctrine. Some people say that caused division in subsequent decades, subsequent centuries, but it clearly set down the actual Catholic doctrine in a whole range of different areas, like the Mass, transubstantiation, confession, faith alone, Scripture alone, the canon of Scripture, 73-book Bible, and all of that. So this is why Trent is regarded as one of the most important church councils in the history of the church. So that's all I have to say for today on these issues. I'll be doing another video next week to summarize and to actually talk about the consequences of actually the Council of Trent and the overall setting of the Counter-Reformation movements. That's it for today. Thank you very much for watching.